Good evening, everyone. This is Atul Gupta, and with me are my colleagues Mukesh, Bansal, and Balvinder, Khurana. And today we are going to talk about digital validation on evaluation boards. So I think this is the topic for today. So let's jump right into that. Okay, so this is the introduction. So I'm Atul Gupta, and I'm currently working as Director for Silicon Validation as part of MME, which is Microcontroller and Microprocessor Engineering Group of NXP, which is responsible for central engineering kind of activities related to development of SoCs, for automotive and other applications. We'll see in a moment, what are the different application areas. Next, I have Mukesh Bansal, who is working as Senior Principal Engineer, and he has experience working in radar domain SoCs validation, and he will be educating us today as well on this topic. Next, I have Balvinder Khurana, who is working as Senior Principal Engineer and specializing in gateway and networking domain SoCs. He will be also educating us on this topic here. Okay, so this is the kind of agenda for today. So we will look at background and importance of validation. We will look at the validation vision and mission, and what are the various validation components. We'll look at the validation flow, typical how a validation environment looks like. We'll look at the debug cycle and equipment used, etc. So let me start with NXP. So NXP is a semiconductor company specializing in multiple markets. So some of our main markets are automotive, industrial IoT, mobile and payment gateways, and communication infrastructure, which includes 5G communication infrastructure. So all of these main markets in which we are operating. So let's start with a very fundamental question that what does a customer need to build a system using a microcontroller/microprocessor? So I think if we think with the very basic things in mind, then definitely we need a microcontroller to start with. Around the microcontroller, definitely we need a board because we need to place these components appropriately on the board and connect them together. So we need power supplies because we want to power the microcontroller plus other components on the board like sensors, motors, etc., which are mentioned on the chart here. We need some memory. So two of the memory types captured here are like flash memories, which is a kind of non-volatile memory, and DDR memory, which is high capacity but volatile memory. We need connectivity to outside world. So few of the connectivity options shown here, like Ethernet for networking, CAN for automotive networking, UART for connecting to a debug terminal or let's say a PC, and USB again, either for data connectivity or voice connectivity or connectivity to a PC kind of environment. So this is kind of a generalized set of which may be there for any particular microcontroller or microprocessor. Then for using the device, we need all the matching documentation to understand how to program the device, what power supplies it works, what IOs it has, what interfaces it can support. So all the capabilities are understood from the documentation. Then we need some software application example because software applications kind of tell us that what are the working examples for this particular product, and we need compiler debugger to work with the software code for this particular product, and we need logging and performance checking kind of capabilities. So with these capabilities, if we move forward, then let's try to understand what is the aim of a silicon solution provider. What exactly we are trying to achieve. So, one of the first things for us is to understand the market requirements. From those market requirements, we want to create a matching documentation, which is sometimes called as a product requirement document or a marketing requirement document, defining what product we want to build. So I'm talking about the very basics here, what it will take to put together a silicon solution. From that documentation, we want to create an integrated circuit or SoC, which is matching the documentation in terms of its implementation. So this match is very important. And once we have this match, and we will see how this match is ensured, we want to deliver this to our customers with a lot of additional information, like we want to deliver with documentation. We want to deliver the tool chain, like compiler, linker, debugger. And we want to deliver an evaluation board that customer can use to test out its concept about the product. And we want to deliver the software drivers. So let's see what are some of the NPI phases of the product development and what checks happen during these NPI phases. So if you start on the left side of this chart, we start with the marketing team giving their inputs about what product we want to build. Among the various concepts which come in various marketing teams, few of them are selected and then further narrowed down on what exactly we want to target as an SoC. From that concept, we come to the definition where the actual definition of the product is kind of finalized. From that definition, we go to planning and scheduling, where we want to build very detailed schedules and plans for the product, how we are going to build the product. From there, we go into execution and actual development. So it is during execution and actual development that all the SoC development skills comes into picture. So some of the skills, like IP verification, because all the IPs get developed during this stage. Things like IP pre-silicon validation, because the validation teams may be also working in this execution and development phase. And then we have the SoC verification, because verification, it's like that how we differentiate between IP and SoC is that IP is all the boxes we talked about in the previous slide, like USB, DDR, Ethernet. And then once we put together all of these IPs and create an SoC, we want to do some verification at the SoC level. So from this, once the development phase is over and the chip is taped out and we kind of get it back from manufacturing, at that point, the validation and the test phase starts. And that's where validation team comes into picture, where we do, SoC validation. So the validation team comes into picture. And we also do SoC ATE testing, which is, automated test equipment, where we kind of do production testing of these parts. Right. And once both these teams give a green flag and give a go ahead for the product to move forward, then we go into qualification and production. So main aim is to find design issues for these 5 boxes which are on the top. But if you differentiate with respect to AT, then that is more of a production test oriented activity. And there we kind of look for more manufacturing reliability kind of issues. If you're aware of, faults like some node is stuck at 0 or some node is stuck at 1, or there may be bridging faults. So many types of manufacturing faults which we want to be checking for. So in this presentation, we will focus mainly on this validation box, post-silicon as well as pre-silicon validation box. Okay, so last line of defense, as you can see from the chart here. So why validation becomes, or any kind of testing becomes important. So this is an example of a news report from one of the big North American car manufacturer, where in 2014 the manufacturer had to recall millions of vehicles because of an airbag defect. And this was root cause to be a software defect which can prevent the airbags from deploying during a crash. So as you can see, this was a life-threatening situation. And if we dig further into the details, it says that certain driving conditions may cause the airbag sensing and diagnostic module software to activate a diagnostic test. And that would prevent the airbag from deploying in the event of a crash. So, there was some error in the hardware and the software, which basically caused the diagnostic procedures to get triggered. So that is essentially, the problem here, and this led to, recall of millions of vehicles. And if we see the cost involved, then this actually, ran into millions of dollars of cost to bring back all those vehicles to a service center, because you cannot just update software, like how it happens in mobile. Today, most of the cars are, are built on legacy platforms, on designs where only option you have is to either bring the car back to the service center and then pull out the module and then change the software, change the hardware and put it back again. So just the cost of calling all these cars becomes huge, huge, huge. So this cost is very nicely captured in this chart, which shows that cost of finding bug keeps on increasing as we kind of find them later and later in the design cycle. So what we saw on the previous slide was an example of this volume production. So of course, in volume production, the cost can easily go even above, tens of millions of dollars. And even penalties may be there, which may run into very high number, because if some court orders that this particular defect was because of negligence, if it is proved in court, then very heavy penalties may happen to you. So the cost kind of keeps going up from this initial design phase to review phase, layout phase, tape out phase, and various early silicon and sampling phases. Okay. So why we don't want to miss any of the bugs? So it definitely leads to loss of customer confidence, loss of market for the product, and loss to the company. It's wastage of effort, time, and money, because once the product is out there, we may have to redesign the product and redeploy in the field. And like I explained, cars have to be brought back and serviced and repaired. So a lot of time and money is lost, and a lot of brand value is lost. And product recall, and sometimes even payment of penalties, as we talked about, if it is proved that there was negligence in the working of either NXP or any of the companies we supplied the chip to and who build the system and the software and those things. So what is the validation team's vision and mission? It very nicely gels with all the things we have discussed right till now. So to enable highest quality silicon to customer, and of course in a shortest cycle time. So if we see this statement, it talks about both the quality, because we don't want to miss any defect, any issue. And at the same time, we don't want to, spend years developing the product that we are basically, out smarted by the market, or we become obsolete. We test so much that we become obsolete. That is not the idea. We want to test for the right amount, with the right amount of people and resources, so that within reasonable time the product is in the market, and we have a high quality silicon where the customers are happy with us. So these are further details of our mission statement. So we want to make sure that the first silicon, whatever we produce, that itself matches the complete spec functionality. So that's why we do a lot of checking pre-silicon in verification, in pre-silicon validation, all those phases. We strive for fastest time from fab out to customer beta samples. So we want to shorten the validation cycle as much as possible, so that the sampling is not delayed to customers, because they also have a long design cycle. Almost any customer may take 1 year, sometimes 2 years, 3 years to develop their final product, take it through all the testing. Sometimes they may be, for example, telecom customers may be testing in multiple countries with multiple standards, and then they may be releasing product into the market. And we want to make sure there are no customer issues after product delivery. So this applies not only to the silicon, but also to the documentation, because the silicon may in some cases be right, but if the documentation says otherwise for any usage parameter, then customer may use it in a different way. And then it may be, kind of operating faulty. And we want to do continuous cycle time improvement and quality year on year, because this is a continuous improvement goal. We don't want to be just a static sitting organization, but always want to make sure that we are improving year on year. So this is the brief introduction, of what the validation team does. Now I will hand over to Mukesh to, kind of take you through the next level details of these validation activities. Over to you, Mukesh.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Atul, for setting the groundwork there. So going forward, basically, yeah, so what are the different kind of checks? So we saw in that slide. So let's see second level detail on them. So basically, first level of check is the our IP verification, right, and IP pre-silicon testing. So here the main aim is to make sure that the module is spec compliant in a standalone environment, because the IP verification or pre-silicon will happen in a kind of a standalone environment. And then when the SoC is built, so multiple IPs would be integrated together. So at that time, the SoC verification and pre-silicon checks are run. So here the main aim is to ensure the IPs are integrated together and they can talk to each other properly once they are put together. And then once the tape out happens, then comes the SoC validation. So here the main aim is to ensure that overall functionality, be it the IP functionality or the integration generated functionality, that is working fine in real life scenarios and real life conditions with all the different collaterals also. As Atul mentioned, that for building any system, we need different collaterals, including the documentation, different softwares and debuggers and tools. So with everything put together, the things are working fine. So that is the aim of the SoC validation. And then basically the application and reference design, there the main aim is to deliver the software driver and demo board for the customer enablement, so that they can quickly build their application and take the product to the final use cases. Then coming to the typical validation flow, what are the different steps which happens during the SoC validation. So very first step is to create the plan for doing the validation, right? And there are different inputs which goes into creating a good validation plan. So some of them I have listed here. So very first would be the reference manual. So this is the customer documentation which customer software engineer or customer engineers are also going to use to generate their software code. So the same documentation is used by the validation team to create their plan. Then we also look at the requirements which might be coming from the marketing team or systems and application team. We look at the use case document created by systems and application team, and we also take into account the data sheet. So the data sheet will list down all the timing related parameters and different voltage conditions in which the SoC can operate, different temperatures where the SoC is supposed to operate, power requirements. So all those basically parametric information will come from the data sheet. So all these documents go into creation of a good plan. Then we review the plan and update it accordingly. And then different scenarios are generated. So whatever are the different scenarios identified to check the functionality of the SoC, those are developed, and there we will need the header file which will be having the register information of the complete SoC. What are the different registers, different bits which needs to be programmed. Then these scenarios are basically are run and on any pre-silicon platform if it is available. So it could be a FPGA-based platform or a emulation-based platform, for example, Palladium or Zebu or Veloce. And in parallel, basically we start the process of designing the board, because that is also a responsibility of the validation team to define what they need on the board for validating the device. So we generate the hardware requirement specification and work with the board team to review the schematic and the layout to make sure that they are meeting our requirement. And once the tape out happens and basically the device is available after manufacturing, and so at that time we take the evaluation board along with the device and different tools which are required, like compiler and debuggers, and execute our different scenarios on the DUT. And obviously, when we run these cases, not everything is going to pass, right? So we have failures which happen. So then the debug cycle goes. So we'll later in the presentation we will share details on how a typical debug flow goes. And then basically when the failures are debugged, so or for tracking all those failures diligently, we log different tickets for that. And for real issues, we work with the design team and other stakeholders to find possible workarounds and check them on silicon also, so that customer can use them. And then once our work is complete, then the results which are generated out of this validation effort, those will be reviewed with the stakeholders. And then at that time, we call it a validation sign-off, where we have completed our execution as well as a debug of all the failures, and the result review is already also done. So that is called validation sign-off, and that's kind of after a lot of hard work, that's the party time for us. So this is a very typical validation flow which happens. So going into the details of how we really do it, so this is one example of one of the evaluation board from one of the radar SoCs, SA2R294. So you can find the details of this on the NXP.com also. So this is the board basically, and here the basically the MCU chip will be put. So this is a socket. Inside the socket, the SoC will be put, and then on the board we have different components. Like maybe here things are marked, like we have a power supply section from where external supply would be given, and then we will be having onboard regulators which will generate different voltages. Then we have a connector for connecting the debugger, JTAG connector. So debuggers are like very important for a validation engineer to know how to use them. So you will see more detail in the subsequent slides. We have some user buttons, some liquid crystal display for interfacing with some of the IPs. Then for external connectivity, we have UART, Ethernet, which Atul also talked about. So in this particular SoC, MIPI camera sensor interface was a required interface where the radar data would be coming in. So we have connector for that. And then we have some other connector for some tracing MTI, and then GPIO headers. CAN is a standard interface for communication, and similarly FlexRay is another automotive communication interface. So we have component for all of them on the board. So you can see that on in validation, basically we have real things which are put on a board which will be used for execution. So it is very different from, say, simulation, where most of the things will be in model, or some of things might not be available at all. So we'll be checking it in as a real customer would be doing in a customer application. Then coming to the different components, like we talked about board, and then here we are talking about compilers. So compilers are basically to convert a high-level code written in a high-level language like C or C++ into the assembly instructions supported by a particular processor. So as you might be aware, there are like normally we have basically different kind of processor can be there in the SoC. It could be a ARM M7 or M0 or A53. So different kind of cores could be there. So they will ultimately execute the binary code. But to make it more portable and reusable, we normally write the code in C or C++, which is compiled by the compiler. So this helps to achieve the optimization because it can there are different optimization levels supported in the compiler. It fastens the development of a software development process, basically because you can use high level language and the code can be reused across different devices. And a few of the examples of the compiler are, for example, GCC compiler or compiler from Green Hills. Right. And as part of validation team, we basically work with these compiler vendors also sometimes to basically get support for the new instructions which are put in any new processor and also validating them on silicon. Then coming to the debug toolchain, so here I'm showing two examples. One is with the which is having a Lauterbach debugger. So this is a standard debugger used by many of the automotive customers also, and also by the validation team. And the second example I'm showing is the NXP developed debugger, which is called NXP. S32 debugger, which is also used by many of our customers and the validation team also. So what are really these debuggers? So debuggers basically help to quickly debug and find a root cause of failure during a validation testing, because as you can imagine, we don't have visibility within the SoC directly, similar to simulation where people can dump and have visibility of the design. So we use the external connectivity to have that access. So debugger helps to in doing that. It allows to download the code into the SoC memory and execute from there. So during the development phase, we can run different scenarios by compiling and putting them into the required memory and executing from there. It helps to quickly read and write to SoC memory and different control registers without a need to write a program. So suppose during the execution of a given binary, if we want to modify something, so we don't need to recompile the code, we can directly using the debugger go and modify some of the configuration and run the same binary again, so that we can check different scenarios. It helps to snoop the memory real time during code execution. So if you want to really see whether the memory transfers are happening properly and things are going fine using the debugger, we can snoop the memory. And they are really important to fasten the software development process because using them basically, if required, the software code coverage can be done, and using different breakpoints and different debug features, we can quickly debug the failures. So those could be a software failure or some real design issues. So debuggers are really helpful for a validation engineer. So in our validation workflow, we work with the tool vendors to closely to stabilize the tools, because ultimately customers are also going to use these tools only. And if combine the debugger and SoC is not working, so that will delay the overall cycle time goal for the customer. So this is also one of our aim to stabilize the tool with the tool vendors. Okay, then one of the other main item which we discussed is the reference manual. So this is in simple word, basically the reference manual is a user guide for the customer. They use the content of the RM should be matching with the silicon design. Otherwise, customer cannot be really use the SoC, right? So for them, it is a design issue only if the SoC is not working as described in the reference manual, right? And then so here I'm showing one example of S32R294 reference manual, which is available on the nxp.com also. And then along with the reference manual, there is a another important document which needs to be shared with customer is the list of known issues, right? So if there are any known bugs in the silicon, then we share a list of that, and along with that, we give the proposed software or hardware workaround by which customer can kind of work around those problems for implementing their application. So validation team has a good role to make sure that both of these documents are basically matching the design. Okay, so validation ensures that the RM and errata contents are true and match the silicon behavior. So validating different silicon issues and their workaround is also part of the validation workflow. Okay, so here I will be showing like what is a typical validation environment looks like. So we have a validation board, and then we have a debugger which is connected to the board, and it is connected to the laptop or PC, right? And in a typical environment, we could have some external equipment. So here I'm showing a kind of a logic analyzer which can be used to probe different signals. Then we will have our scenario written in C, and then there would be compilation done for this, and we might be having some external terminal where a pass-fail status or some debug information will come in. So what would be a typical flow? The engineer will write the different validation patterns which they want to run, and then they will compile it. So it will create a binary file, and that binary file would be loaded into the SoC using the debugger through the JTAG interface on the board. And once that binary file is executed, it will be doing the required operation, and we might be getting some pass-fail status or some information on, say, a hyperterminal, right? So this would be a kind of a very typical validation environment encompassing different components. Okay, then touching base on some of the innovation tools, because everything, the vision and mission which Atul shared, to achieve that, we have to keep innovating. So I'm sharing one of the innovation at very high level. So this was a validation setup for one of the module where a lot of external pins needs to be connected to one another for checking different behaviors, right? So earlier the setup used to be very manual with lot of wires connected, and you can imagine stabilizing these kind of setup would be a nightmare for a validation engineer. So this was one driving factor, and then there were other factors to automate and reduce the cycle time. So we came up with the basically this is the validation setup now. So we have been using it for a few years already. So where it has become really clean. So the SoC board is this one, and then we have a basically reusable board across SoCs where all this connectivity can be taken care of using the software programming. So this FPGA-based automation setup basically helps to streamline the validation activity, both in terms of quality improvement and also to reduce the cycle time for doing the complete work. And then the other like innovation I would like to share is one of the challenge which any validation engineer has is that we might be able to exercise the different modules individually, but running them in parallel and having a scalable approach to exercise different modules in parallel is a challenge. To solve that, we kind of have developed the internal tool. We call it Marvel. So where we can kind of emulate different application use case scenarios where different modules can run in parallel, and we can execute them in different system configuration and using different cores. Right, because now the SoCs are having multiple cores, and customer can exercise the different modules from any of the cores. To cover all those scenarios, we have to do the randomization and automation in our overall execution environment. And then our validation Nova-based automation framework helps to execute these cases also. So at very high level, there would be a host PC which will be doing the compilation of the code and development of the code. And on the SoC, we will be having some real-time OS-based tasks which would be running, doing the system configuration. And then for individual IP, there would be IP tasks which would be running. And when all of these IPs are working, so they will be putting a stress on the system bus. And in the memory, there would be input-output buffer for individual IPs. And this basically, the OS-based approach will run these different tasks in different orders, and with having different system parameters, and the task parameter also would be changed. So this will help us to emulate the multi-master scenarios in validation easily, and find any bottlenecks in the performance area mainly. Okay, so then coming to the basically bug how the debug is done. So now I think I will hand over to my colleague Balvinder to take you through this debug journey of validation. So over to you, Balvinder.
Yeah. Hi guys, I'm Balvinder, and thanks Mukesh and Atul, I think, in relaying this to me now. So guys, I think so far, since we have already seen the kind of vision with respect to the validation and then the workflow from the validation side, right? I think it is very important that we kind of look at, what is essentially a debug in terms of SOC validation, right? Because this is what we are working for. This is what we generally, this is our job in terms of validating the silicon, finding out the issues and finally debugging it, right? And giving a solution to the customer. So before we'll kind of look at the debug workflow, right? Let's quickly look at, typically from the SOC validation side, I think we do two types of SOC validation. One is a digital bench validation, which is essentially the validation of the RTL, the feature set, and the other RTL kind of logic validation that we do, right? And in terms of the other validation is basically the analog, which is mostly on the analog components within the system on chip, right? For this discussion, we are mostly talking about the digital bench validation here, right? So let's say when we start off with our validation, right, there are two approaches that we generally do. So one is before the silicon, right, where the silicon is still in its development and it's still not fabbed out, right? So there we kind of do the validation in the pre-silicon world. And essentially, the idea here is that we have to find out the bugs before the silicon. From an industry point of view, we generally call it as shift left, right? Because we are doing and finding the bugs early in the cycle before the silicon itself. So for this, we generally use some emulation platforms like FPGA, Zebu, and all those where the silicon is still not there. And then once the silicon is available, which is basically a physical, component that we talked about. So we essentially run our test cases to find out the issues, and then thereafter go for a silicon debug, right? So our talk would be essentially around these lines. Yeah, Mukesh. Next. Okay. Right. So then I think this is kind of an interesting point now. So overall, guys, I think whenever if you kind of look at your environment or the things around you, right? I'm sure you guys get into debugs on a daily basis, right? So let's see how a typical debug flow goes, right? So suppose you guys moved into a new house and you got your washing machine installed, right? And when you powered it up, it didn't start. So what could be the potential reasons, right? So ideally, I wanted you guys to kind of respond, but since I think I do see that, so any which ways, I think so. What we can do is like, I'm sure you guys all are thinking, what are the different reasons and things that could be an issue here, right? Yeah. So with this pondering, let's quickly look at. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So let's say I think then in the context of the machine washing machine example, right? What we essentially said with respect to a test fail is that we switched on and it didn't start, right? So that was the fail that we saw. Essentially, this fail can come into different areas when we go about kind of debugging it, right? So either it could be a failure of the environment around where the machine is operating, which we are generally calling it as setup, right? And in terms of example would be like that, when we switched it on, the button itself was faulty, right? So there could be a setup issue there. Secondly, there could be a wire faulty, similar to that, right? So these are the typical areas where we get into a setup environment kind of issues. And with respect to SOC, these are essentially tool issues, board issues, or a test case issue, right? Which are basically the environment that the test case is operating in. Then comes a documentation issue, right? So I think many a times we do see that the vendors of the machine, let's say, have not written a correct documentation. In fact, there was a different switch also that to be switched on, right? So we did not figure it out, and because we are not starting that switch, there was the machine was not getting started, right? So this was basically a documentation issue. Similarly, from the silicon point, there was a trivial thing that was there, but we did not write it down in our documentation, right? Thirdly, essentially, this is the actual silicon issue. So in our case, washing machine itself is faulty, where a component inside the washing machine, either software or a hardware, is not working, right? So in our context, this is more like hardware bugs that we are talking about, right? So essentially, these bugs could be either a functional issue where we say that a given feature itself is not working. Let's say the rotation is not working in a machine, and that's a feature for the machine to rotate, and it is not happening. Similarly, there would be a race condition or a timing issue that could be an issue which is actually giving a problem to the customer. So finally, with all of these issues around, right, it is very, very important that we come up with an acceptable workaround, because there is a problem at the customer end. We have to go, respond to that. So that is what is important out here, right? And in order to make sure that this reaches systematically to the customer, whenever we say that the part is already in production, we call it as an errata, which is something that we know that the issue exists, but the customer should be known about it, right? And wherever we can fix, for example, documentation, we can still fix because it is still, something which is not physical, or let's say, we cannot revert back, right? Yeah, the next one. Yeah, and obviously, with the physical silicon or physical product that we have given to the customer, we cannot replace it right straight away. So we have to go update the next version of it and then provide it to the customer. So this is essentially the cost which Atul talked about, right? Which is actually happening at the customer and creating a problem to the company. Yeah. And finally, but last but not the least, every debug that we did essentially will result in a test case fail, but we will have to still provide a workaround to the customer, because that's how things will continue to work on, right? Washing machine should work, your clothes should still get cleaned. Okay. Then comes the typical debug challenges, right? So in terms of what we initially talked about, typical areas that we see in terms of challenges are either the device under test itself, right? Where there are limited observability in the silicon, we cannot expose them. And so these are particularly in the visibility cases of the device under test, right? Setup itself, as Mukesh initially talked about, right? He was showing, the mesh of the wires, right? So we do not know which point, which mesh in the whole board or the setup, which one is loose or not connected, right? So essentially that's where it is important that the whole tool chain, the whole debug system itself is managed and effectively done, right? And finally the documentation issues, where there is a huge documentation to the customer, similarly to the validation engineer, and he has not looked at everything. Yeah. Next one, Mukesh. Okay, so now that we have kind of looked at the debug workflow, right? I think it is important to touch base on the different lab equipments, because essentially you guys or the validation engineer will go sit in the lab, debug it, and that's where the excitement really happens, right? So in terms of the lab equipments, wherever let's say a debugs come, or we want to do some measurements, right? We use these equipments. The first one is here is an oscilloscope. Oscilloscope is essentially an equipment to kind of observe the exact wave shape of an electric signal, right? And to measure constantly the varying signal voltages, right? So, but let's say there are issues where we are getting to see some challenges, issues in terms of output from the silicon, we use this equipment there. Similarly, we have a DC power supply, which is more like a supply to a range of a DC, supply range, right? And obviously, we want to give different inputs to the SoC in terms of testing, right? So this is the equipment which is used there. Okay, next one. Okay, the logic analyzer. Right. So the logic analyzer is another kind of important tool that we generally use. These are the, this is a tool where we see that, we want to capture signals with respect to timing. So there could be relationships between, given interface and a different protocol that, two signals will work in a given time domain, right? And there could be delays in between due to which there are issues, right? So these are the issues which are generally debugged by making use of the logic analyzer. Right. The next important one is the waveform generators, which are essentially, again, acts as input to the SoC, where we want to provide different inputs like sine waves, square waves. Let's say there are some analog to digital converters, and we give them these inputs there, right? So these are kind of useful there as well. Okay, the next one. Okay, so the next one is like audio precision. This is mostly in the cases where we have audio codecs, let's say on the SoC, and want to debug it, right? Essentially, we want the precision quality, and let's say we want to go, see that there are no certain issues in the whole audio lane, right? So that's where it is kind of used there. The next one is the test centers. So test centers are mostly like exercises, right? It's most like, let's say, an Ethernet interface where we want to inject or let's say monitor the traffic on the protocol level, where we want to see that, okay, how the packets are getting exchanged, if there are some errors in the packet, and we have to have capability to inject different type of packets, right? Like layer 2, layer 3. So this is the equipment which is used there. Yeah. And finally, I think if you kind of look at, right, for example, NXP does operate in most of the automobile chipsets, right, which is actually going into the cars. Now, the cars have to operate in deserts. They have to operate in very low, low temperatures as well. And our chip should also work there as well, right? So therefore, it is important for us to validate this environment conditions beforehand, right? And we have to make sure that the temperature kind of is varied across the SoC and its temperature is thoroughly tested there. So this equipment helps us force the different temperatures and help us validate under different operating conditions. Yeah. Okay. So now that I think, guys, we kind of covered the whole debug flow, we covered the whole, the validation story, right? I think it is very important to understand the real validation mindset, right? And that's where I'm sure you guys are very young. You guys already may have or already, been on the path of creating that kind of a mindset, right? So therefore, we are giving you, the clue how to become a great validation engineer, right? So the first one here, obviously, you guys are very smart. I think we being validation engineers are the smartest in the whole semiconductor industry, I should say, right? We are smarter than the designers because we are wearing a hat of a user, right? We know how to work. We know how the actual silicon will be used at the customer end, right? So that is the real beauty and the real expertise that the validation engineer is bringing in. Yeah, the next one. Yeah, the other one, I think in my whole 20 years of experience, right, I think I have learned only when I have really seen failure, right? And failure means debugs, right? Because ultimately then we have to root cause what is happening, how is it happening, and what made that fail, right? So that is where the mindset has to say that we have to feel excited if things does not work, because that's how the real, interesting stuff starts to happen, right? Important for us is to capture all the information and then, kind of segregate it as part of our debug theory. Okay, learn from mistakes, right? I just a while back I gave you the example of a washing machine, right? And then we call a technician, the first thing that the technician starts to do is to apply his previous learnings, right? Whether the same kind of failure was seen somewhere else, and he's tried to apply the same here. Similarly, I think this is the case with us because we are most of the time doing the similar kind of system on chips, getting to see similar failures. And I think it is important to, also add that as part of your debug theory. Okay. Next one. Yeah. Okay. Okay, the next one is basically, not ignoring the random observations, right? Again, as part of my experience, right, I have really seen that most of the time because of the, either the setups are fragile or in terms of overall, when we are running the whole validation cycle, we see some random failures, right? So most of the guys, I think for a validation engineer is perseverance. What we suggest as a validation mindset to continue iterate to see where the issues are coming, try to isolate it, and try to make those random issues more frequent, right? And that's where we have seen that the issue are really there, right? Because these are could be timing or some race conditions which are happening, but they will certainly come to you as failures. Yeah. Initially, we also talked about, right, care for the customers. What we are essentially saying is that you will have to prioritize your testing more as the customer is doing, right? Because that's how the product will get used, right? So try to use it in that environment, try to, play with the silicon in that way, right? And obviously, let's say if there is a fail that comes, it is okay that there is a failure, but it is important to provide a workaround and also provide let's say information to the customer that this particular spec is not working, right? Still is giving us the reputation back as an organization. Yeah, and then comes the test case coding, right? Because as and when we are writing the test code, we should have the mindset that the test will definitely fail, right? So what will happen if the test case will fail? Do we have the right code? Do we have the right debug hooks in the code? Let's say we have provided printfs, we have provided proper verbose such that we are able to debug it later, right? So these are the thought process that every engineer should have, a validation engineer specifically, right? And obviously the all of the code that we are writing, right, essentially will get reused. So it is important that somebody else will take it and he should be able to replicate the same failures, the same scenarios when he's reusing the code. Yeah, and finally, that's what we are doing here today: teach, share to learn. And as we are doing this, we are also becoming smart. Same is the message to you guys. So in summary, guys, I think what we essentially have talked about today in this session, what is validation? What is the vision statement? What are the different validation types, right? How a typical debug and a validation workflow happens? How does a setup and an equipment look like? And what are the typical attributes for a successful validation engineer? Right. So hope I think you guys got the gist of the validation world, right? And with this insightful session, I think I presume that you guys are also excited to pursue your careers in this interesting domain, right? So yeah, that's the final message and looking forward for you guys now.